and it's good to see so many of you up and having our last day sailing to Copenhagen after our trip through Norway. And as you can appreciate, having now been up through there, how big this country is. We've sailed tomorrow 1,800 nautical miles and through a couple of the different fjords. And can you imagine doing that in a small boat where you'd have to row half the way, of course, between buffets and drinks? But today I'm going to give you a talk about some more of the exploration, which is familiar to you, but particularly how they did it has always been a puzzle for historians, because the Vikings were the first of the great explorers in at least European history. There is precedent, of course, in the Indian Ocean and in Polynesia, and so there's a group of scholars who are maritime archaeologists and ancient navigation specialists who've tried to study how people crossed oceans and got to places where it seems inconceivable to us. But then again, we're kind of taking it easy and we presume we know where we're going. Now, back in Viking times, the world was a smaller place, and the Viking Age, someone was asking me, when was the era, and I again will repeat that the general distinction of the Vikings is when they were on the move and expanding their settlements and attacking Europe. So from the first attacks on England in 793 in Lindisfarne to the invasion of Britain by the Normans, who were originally from Ålesund, Norway. And here's the Bayeux Tapestry account of it, and you can see quite distinctly that the Normans were still using Viking-style boats, though by then they had horses, and they had then become folded into the continental European culture, and then, of course, have gone on into the modern era. But the Viking period was back in truly medieval times, when the knowledge of the world was rather limited and often depicted in what they call a T&O map, which is the sphere of the world with a T across it that was the rudimentary description of the continents and the consciousness of what was out there. So this is another, it's called the T&O style map, with Europe, Asia, and Africa were known, and then consider that the center of the world was the Mediterranean, and then Jerusalem as the central city of the world. This is a later version that also includes a bit of the Americas, so this may have had some information given back from the Norse explorers that did go to the Americas. Now, I described to you earlier how the different Vikings, being the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, went in different directions. So the Swedes went up to Russia, where we St. Petersburg, and up into the rivers, the Volga and the Dnieper, and went down to the Black Sea, the Caspian, went to Baghdad, Constantinople. The Danes pretty much stayed to the coast, and then they were the conquerors of Britain, of course, and then continued all the way down to the Mediterranean, even to Malta and to Italy. But it's the Norwegians who were the most dynamic sailors, who crossed the Atlantic and also came down into Ireland and took control of different parts of Ireland. Now, this was a feat done in open boats that would hold maybe up to 50, 60 people, or the largest of them. And even though we've had fairly calm weather, you can imagine in the rougher times of year how difficult it would be to maintain your course and your health even out there in an open boat. They would cover themselves in furs, and they would have their dried fish and other delicacies. You'll get some of that at lunch today at the great buffet, if you like. And they survived all the way across the Atlantic. Now, the question is, how did they know where they were going? Who told them about these places to the west, especially Iceland, Greenland, and then finally down to the Americas? And some historians have said it was actually the Irish that went there first, most famously the voyage of St. Brendan back in the 600s that may have led the Norse, when they came to Ireland, to be told that there are other islands and good fishing and you could keep going, and some people had already been. Now, these are the boats that they took out. There was two different kinds. This is called the snore, the fighting boat, and this is the kna, or the trading vessel, and they're quite different in their rig. They're both open boats with oars, but the great fighting warships were very slender, longer, faster, and they would hold more men, but they didn't hold much cargo. And then the Cunard were deeper hulled, shorter, slower, better for carrying provisions, livestock, and those are the trading vessels that would then follow to the settlements and cross the ocean. So here's one of the Cunard illustration. You can see they would put the livestock down in the center where they would be relatively safe, but then you had just open decks on either end, and then the sails would go up and the boats would continue. Now, for those of you who in Oslo went to the great Viking Ship Museum, you saw this, the Osberg boat, which has this tremendous prow, the great rising bow, which in this case was a ceremonial boat. It was built with this great fern-like ornament on the bow, and then on the masts and in other parts they have ornamental wind vane and other demon depictions. And this was a very elaborate boat, but built certainly on the style of the actual working boats of the time. In this illustration you can see they're having a fight with some of their neighbors, and the great high bow was actually good for some protection and for using to go up and mount and get off of, rather than a low bow which would take water over the bow and not provide that kind of protection. So the largest of the warships were manned by up to 50 men with oars. They had their sails, and their rig could go up or down depending on the weather, but they had a kind of an oarlock that would be closed in rough weather and when they're sailing, but when they wanted to row and the wind was down, they could open it up and the blade of their oar could fit through there, and they could ship their oars in and out and not have to take them over on the outside. The depiction of shields being on the outside, that may have been done just when they were going into battle, but this is a feature of the Viking boats, that they could be rowed very efficiently. Then they could also be portaged, and this was strategically important because they were so shallow they could go up a river. If they met a headland, they could pull it up. They get cut logs, pull it over the logs as depicted here, and therefore they were very hard to stop. They would come up in the rivers at night, and they could come over the land, and so they were the raiders that were impossible to prevent from getting into the river systems of Europe. And that's one reason why many castles were built all through northern Europe, finally, to have strongholds. Prior to the Vikings, many communities had very rudimentary defenses, but the Viking Age propelled the age of castles. Now here's another illustration from the Bayeux Tapestry, which shows some of the construction. Now here's a couple of fellows who are hammering, riveting, and then caulking their boat. And I'll show you a bit more of this construction, because this is sort of the basis of a lot of subsequent ship construction. So this again is the boat that's in Oslo at the museum, and these are oak and cedar planks that have a rising bow and are then laid off with ribs and timbers and then planks for the hull construction. So they would lay a keel, which is an Old Norse word, and then build up their ribs, then they'd plank it, and then they'd put on these very high bow and stern stems, which were often one large piece that were very solid and held the boat together from either end on what's called the bow stem, stern stem. Here on the keel, the timbers and the ribs are being placed. This is a modern reconstruction of it. And then the planks would be put along what's called a rib knee. This is a bent piece, naturally grown branch, and where it bends out, that would provide the critical strength for the rib construction. And then the planks are quarter sawn, as is illustrated here, and that gives the strongest piece of thin wood, and it also is somewhat flexible. These boats were then riveted together, and then they could move with the waves. If they were completely unflexible, the rivets would break, or the ribs or the planks could break, but these are considered a very flexible construction and good for the open sea. Here are the copper rivets. Later they had iron rivets. They would put them in on either side, pound them together. And so this is the most valuable piece of archaeology is often these metal pieces that are found when the wood is rotted away, but even just by seeing and finding the right layout of the metal, the size of the boat could be determined in archaeology. Here again is the bow stem, which is cut and then placed and onto the keel, and then the planks come up and are attached. Now this is of it's especially art that has been revived in recent decades because of the interest in these construction. So in a few places in Norway, they had still been building small boats, but now they've been building larger reproduction boats. But they have a shortage of good timber. One of the problems of Norway, like other parts of the world, is the good timber was cut long ago and it's never been regrown. So now the timber for this has to come from Russia and Canada, where there are still large wood that can be faired and cut to this length. Here's a single piece bow stem, which was, it takes a unique piece of wood to carve it and cut it out so that all the planks could fit onto that. Here it is, and it's launching a recreated piece. So this is the key structural element of the bow, and then the planks are faired out along that. Here's a reproduction that's coming out of actually a boatyard in Maine, where they built a large Viking-style vessel and then loaded it up, and this was one of the now many that are on display around the northern climates, so throughout Scandinavia and all the way to the Americas. The boats would be weighted with river stones, as you see here, that would provide a center of gravity for the sailing rig. Modern sailboats are often very lightly built with fiberglass, with aluminum rig, and they're very tender and get kicked around quite a bit at sea, so they need a very deep keel to counterbalance that. This kind of traditional construction would just lay a lot of stones all along the center ribs of the boat, and that would provide the center of gravity. You'll see in a lot of the harbors we go, though, that this tradition of boat construction is pretty well continued to what is called the classic Nordic double-ender, where you now have a rudder that is hung off of a stem, which is originally a Chinese invention that came to Europe. But otherwise, this boat is very much like the old Viking vessels, except now it has a deck and more complicated rig and even an engine, probably. For steering, though, traditionally you would have a steerboard, and that is just a big paddle that is lashed onto a post and is traditionally put on what we call starboard. So even this ship, you had port and starboard. The word starboard comes from the Norse steerboard, and that's the side that you would lash your steering board upon, and then that would provide a rudimentary steering, not quite as good as a full hung rudder off the stern post, but if they were sailing or rowing, they would then pick it up, and it would not create the drag that it otherwise would if it was left in the water as they're underway. Here's one of the steering board, and you see that the tiller goes perpendicular, or rather horizontal, to the post of the steerboard. Here's one in action with, see it creates a bit of a wake, and for the canoers in the audience or in your cabin, you can imagine the pressure trying to turn a 50-foot boat with your power, your arms, and the pressure that must have been on those boards. Other things that have been found in some of the archaeology are early forms of anchors where stone would be lashed into wooden struts. Here's an early iron anchor. Now, Scandinavia has some very rich iron ore deposits, and so they were the first to build big iron anchors up here. Of course, they still do it. And then down here is a bailing trough. And a couple of years ago, I was in Stavanger at the marine shop, and they were selling wooden bailers just like that for your little boat, and I went back to buy one the other day in Stavanger, and sure enough, it was plastic, made in China. And so we were asking the shopkeeper, and he said, oh no, whoever the farmers were that made those for thousands of years are now retired into oil future speculation, and we buy them from the plastic shop now, and he couldn't get any more. So that's a tradition that went right down to today. The other advantage of these Viking boats is that they were very shallow draft, and so they could come in, and with their sturdy keel that was not really so deep like some modern sailboats, they could go right up onto the beach, jump ashore, and then go off shopping. And the boats would be sitting in shallow water, and they could get up a river, land wherever they want. And again, this is what made them the terror of Northern Europe, and even down to the Mediterranean, because they would just suddenly appear up into the inlands on the boats. Now, for the rigging for their sail, of course, they'd put up large pine masts, and then they have spars. Their ropes were made out of what they called a wagmal, which was a kind of an oily twine they would make out of wool. And so even the sails were woven and had a lot of lanolin in them, so they were fairly sturdy in the stronger winds, and they did not tear, they were did not rot. And so this has again been recreated by some of the reconstructed boats. Here's one coming out of somewhere in Scandinavia, and the volunteers hauling up the great spar. Now this is a square-rigged sail, right off of a big loom or pit sewn together from square pieces. The lantine, or the triangular sail, was an Arabic and then a Mediterranean-style sail. But in Northern Europe, traditionally they had these big square sails that were better downwind and more stable as you would follow a steady wind. Here's one under full sail. So you can imagine that that was a relief to the oarsmen, that they would be able to sail quite a ways depending on the wind. They could go somewhat close-hauled or toward the wind if they pulled their guy lines and sheets and turn the spar. But that kind of sailing, if the wind changes and suddenly backs on the sail, it can actually knock the boat over. So you have to be very careful sailing with that big a sail in rough conditions. There are other dangers in the sea other than just storms and waves. On the coast of Norway, because of all the fjords and all the islands, there's a great deal of current and tidal eddies, and most famously the great maelstrom, which is up on the Lofoten Island far north of Ålesund. And so this was the famously rough water. The further you went north, the stronger the currents and the weather, and then these kind of creatures were said to come up and swallow the boats. Often it was just the currents would actually draw a boat down, and the maelstrom up there is still marked on nautical charts as a hazard to small craft, because you can get caught in it and it'll take you right down at the wrong time of the day and the tide. But this is an illustration of what was traditionally Norse fear, that there were sea monsters in the ocean, and they call them the kraken. And the kraken are giant squids, certainly, and they certainly do live in the deeps of the Norwegian Sea. Some paleontologists have found up in northern Norway, in the islands of Svalbard, a whole group of fossils of this creature, what they call a plesiosaur, which is one of the largest of the carnivorous dinosaurs of the sea back in the Jurassic period. They all died off, as did most of the other dinosaurs, but there may be a few still down there. And if you've seen that Pirates of the Caribbean movie with Johnny Depp fighting the great Kraken, it's got to be true. There's got to be more of them out there. So that the Vikings, like many sailors, are very superstitious. They go out, and if they get a storm, they start seeing various of these monsters, sort of like the Loch Ness that stayed out on the ocean. But traditionally, all you have to do is find the right mermaid, sing the right song, and you'll be okay. So these different Vikings went off into their known or unknown areas, and most famously Rollo of Ålesund, this is his statue right in the town park, gathered his about 50 ships, and he went on a holiday to France and went down to the coast of Normandy and sailed up the Seine, and I told you how he besieged Paris twice, and he was paid off by being given the tract of land which we call Normandy today. And so Rollo then became the Lord of Normandy, and then his subsequent ancestor or great-grandson William the Conqueror then crossed the Channel and then set up his self in the British Isles. So this was probably the greatest invasion of all of the Vikings into Europe. They actually came and took a large piece of territory. Then, of course, they became part of the continental culture. The other raiders went farther, but they did not settle into such nice places. They continued on farther. For instance, there was a lot of Vikings who went and set up settlements in Ireland. Eric the Red settled near Dublin. Then he moved with his Irish slaves to Iceland. and this had been found by then, as I mentioned, the Irish were the ones who told them about further lands further out. But in the conflicts between the Vikings and the Irish, the Irish that were conquered were put to work for the Vikings, and so when Eric the Red went to Iceland, he took slaves with him. And a recent DNA analysis of the population of Iceland shows that there are more Irish blood in the Icelanders than there are Norwegian, which was hard for the Icelanders to appreciate. But Eric the Red was settling with his family near Reykjavik in Iceland, and he was accused of murder. And rather than face his punishment being thrown off of what they call the hanging cliffs of Iceland, he chose banishment, and so he packed up his about 20 different vessels with his whole clan, and then they went to Greenland. And so he made this journey across the Denmark Strait and around through, this is a very dramatic fjord land down in what's called Kristiansund, and then up near Nuuk, which is now the administrative capital of Greenland. And this is a very dramatic area, like Norway, because it's very high mountains and deep fjords, but it has the additional attraction of a lot of ice. This is the settlement of Eric the Red in Greenland, near Nuuk, north of the peninsula, flat land, and so they settled there. But compared to Norway, Greenland is not green, and it also is icebound. Norway in the fjords does not get iced over, so there can be transit through the winter, and it's not a frozen land like Greenland is. And so Eric the Red and the number of generations of Vikings who settled there continued to travel, but they had trade back to Iceland, but they eventually all died out in about the 1200s. But the legends, the sagas were kept in Iceland, and especially the story of Eric the Red's son, Leif. And he became the discoverer of what they called Helgoland and Vinland. Now that is an area that was presumed to be part of North America, but it was not sure where it was. So now they think that Helgoland is north of Labrador, Markland is the coast of Labrador itself, Vinland was somewhere down, including Newfoundland, and then it's surmised that they may have continued all the way down toward Cape Cod and the warmer, sandier parts of North America, except that by then they were so far from supplies and they were meeting well-populated and hostile native peoples, and there was no record of them. It was two Norwegian amateur archaeologists, Anne Stine and her husband, whose name I don't remember, they had their portrait just put up at the Viking Ship Museum just this past year. But they were amateur researchers, and they went to this coast of North America, Canadian provinces, to look for evidence of the sagas to prove that the Vikings had been there. And sure enough, at Anselmado in Newfoundland, they found a settlement that looked like a promising bay with an upland, and then they found ruins, foundation ruins. But the proof of the Viking settlement was, again, the nails and the iron tools that were genuinely Norse, that would have been made maybe in Iceland or maybe brought all the way from Norway. But that confirmed to historians that, yes, the Vikings had come to North America. And then now that site is a Canadian national park, and they have rebuilt the old sod houses and an exhibit of the settlement that then died out. Now, but how did they get there? The real question is, out in an open boat in a stormy sea, how do you find your way? Traditionally, in the Norse language, the cardinal points are named here: Nord, Landor, Oster, Landsord, Sord, Utsord, Vestor, Utnord. Well, this is just, as you can see, north, south, east, and west, but they would be tied to certain latitudes and time measurements. As navigation, the time across the Earth is marked in degrees, which are comparable to actually the passing of the sun. So 15 degrees of latitude is 1 hour of time. And so the Earth traditionally is in 360 degrees, which then marks out 24 hours as you go around. But what the Vikings would do is put up what they call a sun compass. They put a post on a wheel with the cardinal compass, and then they could take a shadow measurement, and that would help them determine their latitude. So in this recreation of a sun compass, which would be put on a bucket, so it would be level, and on a calm sea they could use it on a boat, or they go ashore and then they could level it out, and at the right times of day, both sunrise and noon, then they could see how the shadow stretched out. This illustration shows, depending on the time of the year, the summer solstice, the winter, as the sun dips, the length of the shadow would be a very accurate measurement of their latitude, so they would know how far north and south they are. The measurement of longitude, how far east and west they are, was always an estimate of how much time they've been sailing. So as what they call latitude sailing was practiced, they would take usually the sunrise, they would get the shadow of their post, their sun compass, and in this illustration they would have a wind banner, so they would also have a measurement of the wind, and then they could get a clear bearings for their sailing of the day. Of course, daylight is a precious commodity in the North, so this illustration shows how much of the year it's dark, but in the height of summer, for instance, right where we are today on the summer solstice, June 21st, you have daylight almost all the time, depending on your latitude. When we were up in Ålesund, halfway up Norway, it was already light all the time, even though the sun had gone into the horizon. Further north, of course, the sun doesn't go down at all above the Arctic Circle. And above the Arctic Circle, magnetism and the North Pole measurements with the magnetic compass doesn't work, because the magnetic North Pole is 1,500 miles south of the axis geographic pole, so you use what's called a sun compass, which is a modern version of a sighting compass for the sun that again gives you your latitude, and this is what polar explorers to this day use when they go to the North Pole or the South Pole, and it's a direct modern version of the old Viking sun compass. So here we are, we're leaving, let's say that's near Bergen, and we want to cross to Greenland. If you could measure the latitude carefully with your sun compass, then you would just be able to measure that daily and make sure you're on the straight track over to where you want to go. And so the old sagas and the verbal sailing instructions were that you would leave a certain place and stay on that latitude and be able to arrive at a point of land. Now this is a Mercator projection which flattens out the actual sphere of the Earth, but if you take it on a more accurate curvature, it's the same. And so if you left Bergen here and you stayed at 61 degrees, you know you'd end up here in Greenland, or Thorhaven, that's in the Faroe Islands, Larvik is the Shetland Islands. And so if you wanted to go somewhere across to those islands, you'd go to the coast of Norway somewhere and you'd measure the sun and get a latitude, then you'd keep that measurement all the way across till you arrive where you're going. In this case, part of the Faroe Islands, you could find your port by being very careful with your latitude sailing, so you'd end up where you want to go. And otherwise, you'd sight certain cliffs and you'd know that you were in the right place, or somebody who had been there before would tell you that that's where you are. To keep a clear view of their latitude there, at night they would also use celestial navigation, where they would look up for the Polaris, or the North Star, using the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, and they could sight it, and they would actually turn their vessel and use the mast as a sighting stick, and somebody at the helm would take a measurement as using the mast as a sighting, and then they would realize they're either going a little too far south or a little too far north, and then they'd adjust their course and continue on. So this is sort of a rudimentary sextant even. And the other thing they could also use would be a zenith star. So if you're out there on a clear night and you see the stars as they sweep the sky, as soon as one rises, you would be able to see where you are in relation to that. And then as it would be right above you at the zenith, you'd know you were following the right latitude. Now this is a technique that is common in Polynesia and also in the Indian Ocean, and is done as an emergency technique trained to sailors to this day. So another way they could estimate this is they would have a stick and they'd put it on the gunwale of their boat, and they would again sight stars with that, and then they could keep markings on a stick, and as they progressed along they'd know whether they were on course, particularly by the latitude. In the settlement in Greenland, a kind of a stone was excavated on a site on the coast which was scraped with markings, which a researcher in Norway has identified as a kind of a sighting stone that had markings for that latitude, for the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and other periods of the time, and that probably was used to train other navigators on how to cross back to Norway, Iceland. And so this stone has been the subject of much interest because it actually fits right onto a modern compass, and thereby they would probably orient it, and then they'd use it to sight and train their navigators. It comes from a site that had a lot of boats on it, and so they think it was sort of a rudimentary maritime academy. And then these etched stones were the only real instrument they have found that had maritime technology that, however rudimentary, was the only evidence of how they made these kind of great voyages. So the researchers think that these markings on the stone, it would be put on a stick, which would serve as a sun compass, and then they could adjust it, move it around, and study the markings and line it up as the season went by with the rising stars or the sun. So this is a stone that is now in a museum. It's actually in Denmark, but it's considered one of the earliest of the Viking nautical instruments. One of the researchers also believes and made a copy and then etched out what he believes are the coastlines of all of the North Atlantic, from the British Isles and Ireland to the coast of France to North America and Greenland. Now, I don't know whether this is really true because the researcher put these lines over onto the stone, and I haven't seen the stone myself to see whether this is perhaps his imagination. But if it's so, then this is a rudimentary map of the world. Well, that's good for training, but when you're out there on the sea and it's suddenly a cloudy day, as we have not had too many on this trip, but if you're trying to go most of the year, the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea are famously rough and cloudy. So the question is that if you had to go out for days and days and you're tossed around, how do you know which way you're going? Now, you may have a record of the wind and you know where the winds are, you can read the wave patterns and you have a general idea, but if you're off 5 or 10 or 20 degrees, you're just going to go out there and be lost. And undoubtedly, many went out and then were never heard of again. So in a grave again in Greenland, a stone was found which was spoken about in the sagas, but had never been found before until a few decades ago, and it's kind of a crystal, a calcite quartz that has a certain angle to it, and then it has a quality of polarizing light. And what they think this was used for is to polarize sunlight in the midst of a cloudy day so that it would indicate where the sun is. And so if you put a dot on the stone, it will be refracted, but as you pass it toward the source of sunlight, it will double up, and then you can aim the stone toward the sun on a cloudy day. Now, this is was quite a surprising find, because this meant that they even prior to any other people, they had a way to orient their vessels at sea on a cloudy day without a magnetic compass, but they could still see where the sun was, and then they could align that with their solar compass on a cloudy day and then get their bearing. Now, these are very hard to find, these stones now. Their quarries in Iceland were exhausted a long time ago, and I actually ordered one from the Mineral Supply, the Geological Service, and it actually does it. You can see the polarization in the stone. And last time I was on the ship, I gave it to the captain just in case they need it on the bridge. But that was one of the secrets of their navigation, and this was considered the most valuable sort of magic thing kept in the pocket of the navigator, and that was one way they made their way across these seas. Later, when the Vikings were, let's say, assimilated into Christianity and civilized, if that's the right word, the knowledge of the Americas and Greenland was lost. But in the 1940s, this map was found, dubbed the Vinland map, which was said to have been drawn in 1434, and it clearly shows Greenland and then the coast of North America. This was said to have been written by a cleric in a monastery, and now this was purchased by Paul Mellon, and it is given to Yale University, where when it was first displayed, it was the subject of a lot of interest about 20 years ago, and then it was subject to some research, and one test inferred that the thing was a forgery. And so it is still a controversial map, but it was the first map in Europe that did show the Americas, of course, prior to Columbus. And so that's the legacy of the Viking exploration, is that they were certainly the first Europeans to come across the Atlantic, but the loss of their colonies and settlements there, and then the lack of communication back to Europe meant that, of course, Columbus and subsequent explorers took the credit for discovering the Americas. But in Scandinavia, they always knew that they had been out there. This is a later map from Bergen in 1579, which shows the clerical extent of the Bishop of Bergen, which included, on this map, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Shetlands, and then this is Greenland, and assorted other lands that were not really sure. It says Jotun's Heimar, which means the home of Jotun the god, which for a Catholic cleric or a Lutheran cleric was an unusual entry. Riesland, which we don't know what that means, but here's Helleland, Markland, and Skrælingland, and then the Promontorium, which probably is Newfoundland. But, of course, by 1574, there had been European settlement. But this is a Norse, later Norwegian map of the area. And the interest in these waters and these territories continued on to this day in Scandinavia. Even though the Viking settlements died out, Danish and Swedish, Danish and Norwegian people went back and recolonized parts of Greenland, most famously Han Egede, who was a Lutheran cleric who took upon himself to Christianize the Inuit people, and he set up the settlements that became under the Danish rule of around Greenland. And he spent his life, as you see, praying for sunshine there in Greenland. And today, Greenland, of course, is this tremendous large island. It has been a Danish territory for now these different centuries, and is now this year getting its full independence, which means they're going to be cut off from aid from Denmark, perhaps. But if you go there, it's quite a dramatic place, and Nuuk is now the capital. You can see in this map of Greenland that all of the Danish names have now been turned into Inuit names, so they are even more inscrutable. But the interest in the Arctic and the Great North, of course, continued in Norse culture to this day, and so here's a later map in the 1600s of the Arctic, which of course was impenetrable. People would go up and get in the ice and they couldn't survive or go any farther, but it was thought that there must be a continent up there, and the Great North had another world to it that would be eventually discovered. And so this man I mentioned the other day, Fridtjof Nansen, took his ship, the Fram, which was a wooden icebreaker, that then got stuck in the ice and was lifted up. It had a rising hull, they call it. It would be picked up by the ice flows, and he drifted for over a year around the Arctic, proving that the Arctic ice cap is not land-bound. It is a moving sea of ice on top of moving currents. And he was one of the explorers that led the modern age, which then led to his friend Raoul Amundsen to go on various expeditions on the same ship, the Fram, which is in Oslo at the museum. But of course, famously, Amundsen was the first to get to the South Pole, beating Sir Robert Scott. And so Amundsen took the title as the greatest of the Norwegian Viking, latter-day Viking explorers of this century. And he was followed by Thor Heyerdahl, who did more tropical sailing. I guess he didn't like the cold so much, so he sailed across half the Pacific and the Kon-Tiki and the Indian Ocean and various other seas. And he has a museum in Waterford, Connecticut, of the Exploration Museum. If you're ever passing through there, it's very interesting. The museum set up in his honor by the Fred Olsen family and line. And the exploration goes on, especially in the far north here, where the Norwegian Polar Institute is one of the leading institutes to study the diminution of the ice cap and the effect on the wildlife and the subsea geology. And you may have heard that the competition for sovereignty in the Arctic is very important these days, because it's predicted that within a decade or two there will be no more sea ice, opening up the sea lanes from Europe to Asia and around the Arctic, so that the Russian, Canadian, U.S., and Norwegian and Danish government are slowly trying to come to some agreement. But of course the problem is that it's very important to the rest of the Northern Hemisphere economy, this area, and it's unlikely to come to an easy agreement, especially since the Russians, because of this, it's called the Lomotov Ridge, they consider this subsea mountain chain to be an extension of their continental shelf. Therefore, a couple of years ago, they went and planted their flag on the North Pole at the bottom of the sea to claim it as Russian territory, which is not recognized by any of the other Nordic countries to date yet. And the Norwegians, of course, have, this is Norwegian Svalbard, and then there's another island called Jan Mayen here, and this is all Norwegian territory here, of course, and then Greenland. And the real question is whether the Northwest Passage will be open or the Northeast Passage will go through the Bering Sea and provide a direct access for shipping right down to Asia that way, rather than going through Suez or Panama Canal. So this is our modern world in action today. One of the more interesting islands, which is Norwegian, is called Jan Mayen. I went there a number of years ago, and it is the largest volcano in the Atlantic, and it is active, spewing hot mud and explosions. There's similar eruptions in Iceland, but not nearly as active as Jan Mayen, which is considered too dangerous for anyone but research scientists to live on. But that's one of the great polar research stations of Norway these days. And then there are the other, let's say, more intrepid individuals, like Lars Monsen, who was the first man to ski from Siberia to the North Pole and then down to Greenland. Took him about 6 months of pulling his own sled along. And this is record-breaking extreme skiing. He's followed by another Norwegian, Liv Arnesen from Oslo, who was the first woman to ski across Antarctica with her American partner, Anne Bancroft. And now she is skiing the entire Arctic ice cap, all the way around from Norway to Canada to Russia and back to Norway. So she's on a long-legged trip. And then there are the other explorers of Nordic heritage, one particular American, Kathy Sullivan, who was part Norwegian. And when she flew over Norway, she took a picture of her ancestral homeland. And then in the future, there will be new Leif Eriksons out there into farther space. So let's say the Viking spirit goes on, but of course with no longer using sunstones or sighting sticks, they have the leading edge of technology to help in the further exploration of the world. And in the sailing tradition, there are all these recreated vessels and schools that are retraining a whole new generation about this history and then some of the techniques and getting out there and getting real salty again. I have a friend of mine who is on the world's longest sail journey. He's American, but again has some Norwegian ancestry, and he built himself his concrete polar schooner, and he is taking 1,000 days at sea without provisioning or stopping anywhere. He has a hold full of supplies, and then the aft of his vessel has a greenhouse, so he grows vegetables and has trawling nets, and he has fresh fish all the time. But he's now, I think, 821 days out of port, and unlike Leif Erikson, you can Twitter and Facebook with him and find out what he's thinking about every day. But he's out there all alone for almost 3 years. He tried to get funding from NASA as a psychological experiment comparable to sending someone to Mars and back. But of course, NASA doesn't believe in fresh air or sailboats, so he didn't get the funding. But you can look it up at the website, 1000daysatsea.net, and someday, whenever he comes back to shore, he'll have a few stories to tell, just like the other Viking explorers. And so with our brief time in Norway and on these seas, I hope you can appreciate this this human spirit that led Vikings across the seas, and then enjoy our visit to come up to this part of the world. And I wish you a bon voyage or a good reise. And with that, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to sail with you. Thank you.